The Real Estate Story with Adrian Butera.
Hi everybody, and once again I'm excited and delighted to bring you the real estate story, coming to you live from my daughter's bedroom here in downtown Williamstown. Really pleased to have everybody joining us here today, both live and of course on the podcast through iTunes and Spotify and all other good podcast channels. For those that have been following the Melbourne property market, well, stage 4 restrictions have now ended, and that is so exciting. But as far as real estate goes, we are inspections by appointment and only allowed into the office for urgent and important work. Other than that, our office remains closed, and we're operating in a COVID-safe environment. But importantly, joining me with today's episode, you can see on the screen, you can see joining us here today. And if you're listening in, I'd like to put a very warm welcome to Andrew Cox from Local Lawyers. Welcome along, Andrew.
Hello, Adrian. How are you?
Yeah, very good, very good. I'm really pleased to have you along here today because we're going to talk about something that we've never talked about on the real estate story, and that's commercial real estate.
Sure, no problem.
Andrew, you're a prominent local lawyer, excuse the pun, but you operate Local Lawyers as well.
Thank you. Yes, we do. As you know, my father, brother as well, we all operate together, family business, and we have a number of other colleagues as well together with us. So I've been practicing for just under a decade, as is my brother, and father's been around for a long, long time. We started a business about 10 years ago, and we very much enjoy it. We like working together. It beats getting a real job.
It sounds to me you've got a real job, though. You work pretty hard. We were talking about that before we went live. Now, tell me, what's your specialty at Local Lawyers? What do you particularly focus on?
So I do commercial leasing law and general commercial and business law. So if you were a landlord of a factory in an industrial area, or if you were a landlord of a shop in a high street in Williamstown, Altona, any sort of suburb, CBD, you wanted to lease to a bookshop or a restaurant, cafe, something like that, you would have to have a lease in place between you and your tenant. And if you were the landlord, I would prepare the lease. And if you were the tenant and you came to me seeking advice, I would tell you what the documents say and help you negotiate things to make sure not only that you understand what you're signing, but most importantly what your obligations are and how I might be able to add value to what is going to be quite a large business decision, either for a landlord or a tenant, considering the documents will last for many years and usually tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars will be exchanged. That's the main part of my job. The other main part is commercial law. So if you one day, Adrian, wanted to purchase another real estate agency and expand Compton and Green all across Melbourne, you could come to me and I could help you to facilitate those documents to sign a contract of sale of business. So again, that applies across all different types of industries. There's a lot involved. It's an interesting job. It's difficult, it's time consuming, but it's rewarding, and it allows me to think and use my limited brain power to help people, and that takes up my time.
I'm sure it's not that limited. I'm sure it's well tested and well versed. But so let's go right back to the first component there in commercial leases, and let's talk about tenants for a moment, and you acting for tenants. What are some of the biggest challenges or frequently asked questions that tenants are putting to you as their lawyer when they're about to enter into a commercial lease? And of course, there's a couple of types of leases, isn't there?
That's correct, there are. It really depends on where your client sits on the experience scale. So usually a tenant of a small business, their first time that they would be dealing with somebody like me is when they decide that they no longer want to operate their business from their garage, and they want to go into perhaps taking their business into a small cafe. And they really have no idea about all of the potential issues and pitfalls that they'll be opening themselves up to. That's on the one end. Then on the other end, you would have a very large tenant Usually the largest tenants will go to the biggest lawyers in the city. That's just the way it is. But occasionally, particularly over in the West, a lot of people don't like to leave the West. They don't want to go over the bridge still. And they just want to find somebody who knows what they're doing and won't charge through the nose, because lawyers are, not cheap. But we like to think that we had
What is it?
value.
What is it with the big tenants going to the big lawyers? Is that relevant, or is that's just naturally how it happens?
Naturally, how it happens, I mean, everybody in their life would develop connections. And so normally you will get the painter who you know, you'll get the plumber who you know. And these large tenants are generally legacy businesses over a long period of time. And they will have just gone with certain lawyers or law firms who are from the larger end. And that's just the nature of it. Now, occasionally a tenant will get new management in and they'll say, well, maybe we can get this done somewhere else. And that's normally when they'll come over to us. Or same with a landlord, and more so with landlords, because they generally use lawyers more. They will realise, well, hold on, I'm not sure I need to go into the city to get this legal work done if I can find somebody, a firm who's able to do it closer to me, and they're reliable, and I know that they'll do a good job. So that's pretty much how it happens. And tenants at the moment, and landlords, it's been a very difficult time for them with COVID. And that has exponentially increased what I need to do to help them. That just happens because it's the area that I practice.
You'd be putting in a lot of overtime, as many professionals would at the moment.
Probably.
And all trying to help people, which is it's all a good cause. I get that. Let's go back to those leases. Now,
Sure.
what are the different types of leases that I might be asked to sign when I'm about to rent my first commercial building or property?
Sure. So probably now 90% of what's the umbrella term is commercial leases, and within that umbrella term there are retail leases and non-retail leases. 90% of commercial leases are now retail leases, and that means they're governed by what's called, unsurprisingly, the Retail Leases Act, which is a piece of law from the Victorian government. And what that law is designed to do is to assist tenants to get them onto a more even playing field. Generally, landlords are in a stronger position than tenants, generally, because landlords will have more money and they will own the property, and they're able to have access to more professional advice, such as accountants and lawyers. And so the understanding of the Act goes, tenants are small, they don't really know what they're doing, so the government will step in as a consumer protection method and law to allow them a more even footing. And what the Retail Leases Act does is give the tenant a whole raft of protections that tricky landlords would have previously got people like me to draft the documents in a way to not give tenants those protections. For example, the main one is if you're a tenant of a retail property, which is now pretty much, as I said, 90% of properties, and the way it's defined is if you sell your goods or your services for a fee to members of the public from the premises. So a real estate agency, for example, you sell your services to people from your property, your office, that's a retail lease. Any restaurant is a retail lease. Any massage parlour or bookstore.
Lawyer?
Yes, lawyers, provided that there are a whole raft of exceptions, which I don't really need to go into because it'll be boring to a number of people, I'm sure. But yes, your high street lawyer, as I said, if you were to sell kitchenware, I'm looking around my house now, microwaves, fridges, right? All of those shops, your mum and dad stores, they're all protected by this Act. And what the main thing it does is it means that a landlord can't pass on their land tax to the tenant as an outgoing.
Right.
And that's what landlords want to do, but the Retail Leases Act says you're not allowed to do it.
Yeah, prevents them. Mate, you've just given it away that your study is the dining room table.
It's correct. Yes, it is. Well, I've got good light in here, and
Yeah,
it makes
good on
me feel not so cramped in, having to spend 22 hours or whatever it is a day in my house for the last X number of months.
Yeah, well done on that. So the other form of lease, is that just called a non-retail
yes,
lease?
a non-retail commercial lease.
Sounds like we should watch out for them.
Yes, if you're a tenant, you should. Generally, so the purview of the Retail Leases Act means that any property where you, as I said, sell goods to the public means that you're covered by the Act. So it's only a very small number of properties where that won't apply. Generally, storage will be the number one. So if you're going to, let's say you're a plumber and you've got, or an electrician or some other form of tradesperson, and you've got a lot of equipment and you need to store it somewhere,
Right.
then,
Yep.
out in an industrial area, so those around Willie would know, down in Corroy Creek Road, or those in the west would know all the development happening down in Derrimut, Truganina and the like, where small factories are popping up all over the place. And a lot of those are used for storage of the tenants' business equipment. Those properties generally will not be subject to the Retail Leases Act, and they will allow the landlord to pass on its land tax. They would allow the landlord to always increase the rent every year, no matter what, which the Retail Leases Act doesn't allow. The Retail Leases Act says, well, if the economy goes down and we've agreed that the rent will be increased by or reviewed by Consumer Price Index, then the rent would go down. Landlords don't like that under any circumstances.
No, I wouldn't imagine they do they?
Yes. So it's pretty much, if the Retail Leases Act does not apply, then the law of the jungle applies.
Yeah, okay.
All it is what a party can negotiate best, and that's why they come to me and I try and help them.
So the type of lease is clearly one of the most fundamental components of that whole transaction.
Correct.
What's the next component? What's the next item, if you're advising a tenant, that you need them to be wary of, or is the most frequently asked question that a tenant's asking you?
Sure. What I would say for a tenant would be, I obviously don't know about the rent, right? I'm a lawyer, I'm not a property valuer. Once you guys agree to the rent, I understand that, but I need you to know how long you're going to be bound. So the length of time for the lease would be the second main point. So if you're just starting out a new business, or maybe this is your second business, or you're growing, but you're not a huge business, you might employ one, people, two, or you're on your own. Do you really want to be signing up for a $30,000 a year shop on Ferguson Street or another main street in the suburb, Anderson Street in Yarraville, $40,000 for your cafe with a 5-year guaranteed term? I would normally say you don't want to do that, because you will be obliged to pay the landlord $40,000 a year times 5, $200,000 round figures. And what happens if your business doesn't go well and you want to close it down after 18 months? Tenants will often say, oh, well, I get to walk away. And I say, no, you don't. You have to keep paying the landlord until the end of the lease term, even if you're out of business, or until the lease is transferred. Either way, once you go out of business or decide this is no good, you don't get to walk away, and it becomes very, very expensive.
It's a responsibility, isn't it? It's just making it crystal clear that responsibility carries with that tenant until the end of that first term, because often there is a second or third or whatever the agreement is.
That's correct. So a lot of people don't understand that. They think I can just walk away, and I need to make it abundantly clear to them that no, they cannot. And if they try it, landlords generally will sue them, and the landlord will win, and their assets will be on the line. They may have just purchased their first home through a reputable real estate agency such as Compton Green, and then all of a sudden that property's on the line, and the landlord may seek to sue them. So they need to understand that when you go into business and you're renting these types of properties that, at a minimum are worth $800,000, sometimes up to $2 million, it's not kindergarten.
Yeah, it's big business.
And they will be held to their obligations.
Yeah, it's really big business. And so I understand that that's a huge responsibility for those tenants.
Yes.
Things like outgoings.
That's the next one.
That's the next one. Tell us about that. Where are the hiccups there?
Yeah, a lot of people think, okay, so if you've only ever had experience renting a residential property, you know, okay, my rent's $400 a week, and the landlord pays for the council rates, and the landlord pays for the water rates. The opposite is true in commercial and retail leasing. If it's not residential, so if it's part of the commercial sphere, 99% of the time the landlord will make you pay their outgoings. And outgoings for commercial properties are more expensive than for residential properties. So if you were to rent a $40,000 a year shop down in Ballarat Street in Yarraville, then you can expect that your council rates would be $5,000 a year, your building insurance would be $2,000, and your water rates would be $1,000. And when you add in the odds and ends, that's $10,000 a year in outgoings.
It's a lot of money
to pay on top of the rent.
Yep.
So if you're going to set up a cafe selling $5 coffees, then you need to make $200 a week just to pay your outgoings, and that's not nothing.
It's a lot of coffee.
Yeah, that is a lot of coffee. And so when you talk to people that don't know, their first reaction is normally to scratch their head and say, I had no idea.
Luckily enough, though, there's a lot of real estate agents out there in those suburbs, and all they do is drink coffee.
I'm the same. I think I've had 4 this morning.
Oh,
I'm addicted.
Yeah, good on you. So,
so that's another big one.
That's a biggie. Yeah,
So-
that's a biggie, and I can understand that because a lot of people forget that. They go,
Yes.
I've heard tenants say, "Oh yeah," and the outgoings, and not even ask what they are
What they are.
until the very last minute. But of course, they need to be disclosed in a commercial retail
That's correct.
lease. What's that called?
Yes, so a disclosure statement is a document that accompanies the lease, which is required by the Retail Leases Act. The purpose of the disclosure statement primarily is to give the tenant an accurate estimate of what its outgoings will be in the first year of the term. Obviously, they will increase over time, like everything else becomes more expensive, but it requires the landlord, and the landlord needs to give me the advice so I can prepare the disclosure statement, to say, okay, your council rates I estimate in accordance with last year would
Yep.
be $5,000. Your water rates would be $1,500 and your building insurance would be $3,000.
Just so there's no surprises.
No, correct. The purpose is to give allow the tenant to make an informed decision.
Yeah, well,
If you were to deal with a
Wonderful.
factory which doesn't have this disclosure requirement, a landlord is not obliged to tell the tenant what they are.
really?
Correct. Now, a tenant can ask as part of its due diligence, but if it doesn't ask, the landlord's not obliged to say.
Yeah, okay.
And then the landlord just drops it on the tenant and say, here you go, pay me. And if you don't pay me, I'll terminate the lease, I'll kick you out, and then you can keep paying me until the end of the term.
And when does it not apply? That just goes, you said it, but just repeat it.
Only when it's not a retail lease.
Right, okay.
Right.
Yep, big
So
warning.
only in like the storage type,
Yep.
or if you've got a powerful tenant. So if you're a big tenant and you're publicly listed on the stock exchange, you're not protected by the Act, because the law says, well, you're big enough to look after yourself. You're big enough to ring up someone like Andrew and say, what's this, what's that mean? Whereas it knows that some people, sole traders, they might not have $1,000 to obtain this kind of advice.
Yeah, fair enough too. Fair enough. Now, of course, there's two parts of the equation, and the other part is the landlord. What does the landlord need to look out for in a commercial transaction such as a lease? They ring you
Sure.
up and go, mate, just prepare the contract or the lease. It's a retail lease. What does a
Yeah.
landlord need to be ensuring that they include or instructing you to put in?
Very much good question, and landlords are probably 80 to 90% of my work, and so I deal literally with dozens a month. So lawyers are black letter type people where we like to argue and we like to find loopholes. And not all of us do. I'm not particularly like that. However, I know that my other lawyers who I have to work with are, and therefore I need to be on guard for it.
Of course.
So, Adrian, if you and I were to sign a contract and you actually got your wife to sign it instead of you, and then I sought to sue you, you would say, Andrew, the contract's not with me, the contract's with my wife. My wife doesn't have any money, so you thought you might have been having a contract with me, but you don't because my signature's not there. And what I, as a landlord, need to do is I need to ensure that my contract is with the correct tenant.
Right.
I need to ensure that if Adrian's going to be occupying my property to run his real estate agency, that he's the one that signs, not his wife, not his sister, right? Not somebody down the street. Because if it's not him that signs and then he doesn't pay me the rent, I can't sue you, which is what I need to be able to have that fallback position to make sure that you've got skin in the game.
Yeah, there you go. That's a beauty. And by the way, I did sign my lease. I've signed all my leases. Just want to cover off on that for anybody listening.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too. You've got to stand behind your word. But that would be the main one. The second would be oftentimes tenants will incorporate a company to run their business. Many people do. I'm sure you do.
Yeah.
I have. And the companies are colloquially known as $2 companies. That means that the company itself has no assets. So again, this is a legal construct, the invention of a company. It doesn't actually exist, but it allows people in society who are running businesses such as us to create it and for those companies to enter contracts. Now, Adrian, if I had a contract with your company and your company didn't have any assets and you stopped paying me the rent and I went to sue your company, you'd say, no problem, you're not going to get anything. So what I need to do is to make sure that if we do that, which is 80% of the documents I do, I know who the director is, and that director would be Adrian Butera, Director of Compton Green, and I make Adrian Butera personally liable.
So it goes beyond, so that guarantee, and am I hearing correctly, that's a personal guarantee.
Correct.
Personal guarantee of the lease, and the lease may be in the name of a company name, which is
Correct.
effectively a $2 company. So that
Correct.
personal guarantee, that person is then responsible. I love that word, responsibility.
Responsible, that's right.
And if they then are obliged to fulfill the obligations of the lease if the company cannot.
Correct. And it is the single most important aspect when acting for a landlord. And if I don't do it correctly, as the landlord's lawyer, the landlord would quite rightfully sue me for being negligent. So usually if I'll get perhaps a new client and they'll walk in and they may have got their lease prepared by themselves, or they may have downloaded it from the internet and they'll say, oh, my tenant's not paying, what can you do to help me? And I look at the document and it will invariably either be in the name of a business name, which is not a legal entity and therefore is not enforceable, or it will be in the name of a company and it will not have a guarantee. And I will say to the landlord, you may as well use this document as toilet paper, because your tenant is not liable and you will not be able to sue them. And that normally hits them like straight between the eyes. And I say, well, I often don't have to, they've figured it out themselves. Next time you do a lease, you should get somebody like me.
Yeah. It demonstrates that good advice at that time is so critical. And when I say that time, I often say to people, when things are good, that's when you need the advice, because it's not always good, and we don't always know when it's going to be when it's going to go bad, and that advice is incredibly valuable when it goes bad.
Think of it like as an insurance policy.
Yeah, spot on. Yeah.
And the other thing is, when we have the nature of these lease documents, retail, non-retail, commercial, doesn't matter what it is, think of it as a red line transaction. There's a red line, and once the document is signed, you can't ring the tenant up the next day and say, oh, look, sorry, do you mind changing it? Because I've made a blue here.
Yeah.
Because the tenant will say no. And then when you come to see me, I'll say, I can't help you.
Yeah, that's crazy. Now,
Yes, it is.
there are so many other elements that we could talk about, and I know that there are other documents. There's I wanted to talk to you about the sales. Let's just briefly talk about sales.
Sure.
Sales of, obviously, we talked about businesses, the sale of real estate, commercial real estate, both busy environments here in the inner west, because there is so much real estate, industrial zone being subdivided, carved up. I imagine that's a big chunk of your work.
It is.
What's the advice? And I want you to imagine that we've got some prospective vendors, commercial vendors listening. What's your advice to those vendors that are going to get involved in commercial development and I want to buy a site? What would you tell them to look out for?
Very important to do as much due diligence as possible. I just had an email come in from a client, literally at 1:20 p.m, and she gave me a 2-page letter, because she's looking to buy a property somewhere, and she wants to develop it, put 2 factories on there, and she said, well, she knows herself, she's quite sophisticated at it, but she knows she needs to look for the zoning first. She needs to understand what it is she can do with it before she signs, right? Or before she tries to sell. So if you've got a seller, a vendor, and they're looking to perhaps add to their commercial portfolio, they need to undertake all of the standard due diligence exercises that would be applicable in a residential transaction, such as reviewing the Section 32 statement and the contract to see whether there are any easements or the like. But then if you want to build something like a factory, you've got to make sure that the ground is stable enough so that you can put a concrete slab on there and put the concrete pylons in to make sure that you can actually support a building of that size and structure. Some people don't do that, particularly down in Williamstown and Altona. We're close to the coast, and you could have soil underground, which I know that there is the case in many places around there, which isn't suitable for that type of development.
So it requires a more significant footing and therefore advanced higher building costs.
Correct, very much so.
Yeah.
And you might be able to estimate easily the building, or not easily, but more easily, the building cost of a standard residential build than what may happen with a commercial build. The other very large, and it's not even to do with law, the other very large consideration you need to take into account is that if you're going to purchase a commercial property, banks are far more wary as to how much they're going to lend you.
Of course.
So you need to have significantly more capital available to you. Rule of thumb would be 40 to 50%. If you want to buy $1 million block of land, you better have $400,000 in the bank that you can spend on it, because a bank normally won't give you more than 60% of the purchase price, and then you're going to have to be able to fund a build, and a bank will be quite reluctant to do that.
Don't forget the stamp duty there, Andrew. There's stamp duty on top of that as well.
One of our favourite taxes.
Yeah. That
could be a whole other half hour. I personally think it should be abolished, but that's separate. So the other most important consideration that you need to understand is that if you're going to enter into a contract with these types of people who are in this game, right? People who have commercial properties, normally they will be sophisticated. They know what they're doing. And they're going to try and put things in contracts using people like me to try and trip you up, to put, as a purchaser, to try and put obligations on you. For example, there might be contamination on the site. Now, if you're out in an industrial area, or if you want to buy a petrol station or a former laundromat, which had all those chemicals to wash the clothes, you may purchase it, and the council may say, well, there might be arsenic or lead or petrol remnants in a formal petrol station, or there might be nasty chemicals in the laundromat. And if you want to be able to develop this property as residential, you're going to have to spend, as a standard type sized
a lot of money,
petrol station, $500,000 remediating.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
So that responsibility, no matter you buy a property unconditionally, that responsibility carries over to the new buyer straight away, even though.
Yes.
And I have heard of situations where the major petrochemical companies that own service stations took on their own due diligence, decontaminated the site themselves to the best of their ability, and then sold the land, which is a good way to do it.
Yeah, it is a good way, provided that, and it only requires two things. If the vendor is unable to unload it with that contamination, which would be the reason why they would go to the expense, and if the vendor is able to fund it. So the vendor says, okay, well, a contaminated site might net me $2 million, but if I spend $1 million remediating it, then all of a sudden I've got a clean site and I could get 3.5 or 4 or 5.
Yeah, it's worth it to them. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, pure. But a vendor might say, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, of course.
Pure commercial negotiation.
Andrew, we could talk about so many other elements of commercial transactions in lease and sales, and of course businesses that you touched on. I want to end up on this, and it's quite ironic that you talked about stamp duty, because I'm not going to talk about stamp duty, but stamp duty is a state tax, and stamp duty is the largest funder to the state government. 50% of the revenue comes of the state government's funding comes from stamp duty. And of course, during COVID, that almost came to zero because there was very little real estate being transacted. So it's COVID that I want to talk about. How has COVID impacted your business? I think I know the answer. What's the short answer? Is there a short answer?
I don't get as much sleep as I used to. That's the short answer. In my practice area, we've become a lot busier with all of the negotiations between very stressed landlords and stressed tenants. There is no easy answer for something that nobody foresaw. The government decided that landlords can wear an obligation, part of it, by providing rental relief to tenants, because the government is trying its best through making very difficult decisions to get everybody through. Now, there's a saying in litigation that when everybody's unhappy, you've normally reached a good outcome. So neither landlords or tenants are happy with this situation. Everybody's quite stressed. And that would probably indicate that the government has done as well as they possibly could have.
It's a good answer.
In terms of our business, we're okay. Fortunately, we're very lucky. We're able to work remotely. I have significant anxiety for and sympathy for those people who aren't. Restaurants, cafes, and the like. I'm sure everybody knows them. But fortunately for us, we were concerned in the beginning, like everybody else was. But we've managed to get through. Probably partly because we're a family business, so we can all just rally around each other. And that's pretty much the end of, hopefully, of most of the COVID now with the openings.
Yeah, we hope so.
I hope. Yeah. Although, I've had more inquiries just this morning, so who knows?
Yeah, we hope so. And it's been a really challenging time for a lot of businesses, and some we know have closed their doors and they'll never open again. And I really sympathise for those. I know it's terrible, really hard, but it's great to see you, Andrew. I sincerely appreciate the time you spent with us. It's only 32 minutes, but it's been an incredibly valuable insight into the commercial real estate market. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Cox, Local Lawyers, a great firm that cover all aspects of real estate transactions from a legal perspective. Reach out to them here. You cover all of Victoria, don't you?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, even though you're local. You're local lawyers.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well done. People at heart. Andrew, thanks for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us on The Real Estate Story. We'll see you next week.
The Real Estate Story brought to you by Compton Green.